Well, hello, Fusion friends, and welcome to week 8 of this Connect group session. I hope by now that you've had a chance to complete your service project or have plans to do so in the next couple of weeks. One thing that we also encourage each of our groups to do is to plan some kind of fun hangout event during the break, and that's coming up in just a few weeks. With only 2 weeks to go in this session after today, it might be good to go ahead and start planning that event now. I really enjoyed working through the letter from Paul that we call 1 Corinthians. And today we find ourselves in chapter 2 of what we call 2 Corinthians. Now, I say what we call because I want us to remember or maybe learn for the very first time that the 2 letters recorded for us in the Bible are not the only letters that Paul wrote the church in Corinth. In fact, what we call 1st and 2nd are actually 2 and 4. On his second missionary journey, Paul spent 18 months in Corinth. And after he left, he heard of some immorality happening there, and so he wrote a letter that we don't have. It's lost. And after a reply from that letter from the Corinthians, Paul wrote what we call 1 Corinthians. He hears about some false teaching that's going on. He makes an emergency visit to Corinth that's called the painful visit. You see it actually referred to in verse 1 of chapter 2. It was painful for Paul because apparently some of the Corinthians backed the false teachers and not Paul. So he leaves and he writes what was now called the severe letter. We don't have that one either. He sends that letter with Titus to be delivered to Corinth. The Corinthians respond in repentance over their behavior and how they acted. Paul, being wise enough to know that rebellion, it might spark up again, he writes 2 Corinthians, or what might more accurately be called 4 Corinthians. It's the 4th letter. Now, I tell you all of that because in chapter 2, Paul is going to refer to some events and some correspondence in the chapter and in the chapters to come that we don't really have context for because we don't have those other letters. There are 2 things going on in chapter 2 that we're talking about together today. Paul starts by saying, I wrote you a letter instead of visiting because the last visit, the painful one, it didn't go so well. And now I'm going to bounce around a little bit because the end of the chapter tells us that Paul was really nervous about how they were going to respond. Remember, he sent that severe letter with Titus, and he was really hoping to get an update on how it was received. And so we read this in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. Paul says, when I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, even though the Lord opened a door for me, I had no rest in my spirit because I did not find my brother Titus. Instead, I said goodbye to them and I left for Macedonia. Now, he eventually finds Titus and he's overjoyed to learn that the church in Corinth had repented of their support of false teachers. Also, apparently, when Paul was there for the painful visit, there was some kind of altercation with a man who, as a result of how he behaved, was subjected, the man, not Paul, was subjected to church discipline. And in the first half of the chapter, Paul is telling them that he appreciates how they handled the situation. He affirms that discipline was needed and that it was carried out correctly. Now that that man, the one in the altercation, had repented as well, it was time to restore him to the body of the church. 2 Corinthians 2 is all about repentance and reconciliation. God is always at work in the heart of believers, even when we fall short. So we, as part of the church, should call out sin when we see it and work with the offending party to help them overcome it. And when there's confidence that that has happened, we should be ready to fully restore our relationship with them and theirs with the church. Let me ask, have you ever seen this happen in church? Maybe you could spend some time discussing with your group how you've seen Christians get this right, and maybe even sometimes how they get it wrong. Thanks for watching and listening. I pray that you all have a great discussion around chapter 2. We'll see you again soon.